My name is Chris Packham and I'm very pleased to be at the Royal Society today because the Daily Mirror are going to publish a climate issue, because the climate is everyone's issue, not just the readers of the Mirror, but the people of the world. And what's very exciting at this point in time is that that issue is being continually raised in terms of public awareness. And this, after many years of campaigning from people like myself, is a breath of, hopefully, fresh air. I think we've got some real traction at the moment. I think we face one difficult problem, and that is that we have to make sure that we don't just scare everyone to death, scare them into a point where they think that they can't do anything meaningful themselves. So I'm hoping that today is going to be frank. I think it's going to be serious, and therefore it will command people's attention, but I hope we'll also leave everyone with a job to do, because we can empower ourselves to make a difference. Every single one of us can contribute something positive to making the climate a better place to be rather than worse.
So good afternoon, my name's Alison Phillips and I'm the editor of the Daily Mirror. And welcome everyone to our first ever panel on the climate crisis, and thank you so much to our panellists who are here today, for taking the time, and also to all you people as well who are joining us here today. So why are we here? Well, I think from the video and from the fact that you're here, you will probably all know the reasons that are quite self-evident, that our planet clearly is in crisis and it is time now for action. But secondly, why we are here is to look at our role as part of the British media in creating that action. The Mirror has a very long and proud tradition on campaigning for justice and on issues that affect our readers and wider society. Just for a bit of background for those of you who don't know much about us, in 1912, when the Titanic went down, after that it was the Daily Mirror which campaigned that from that day forwards, no ship should ever go to sea without enough lifeboats for everybody on board a ship, not just the rich people that the Kate Winslets of that situation. And then from those clips that you saw up there afterwards, we were also the people that worked with the World Wildlife Fund in creating that back in the early 60s. And it was our work on the fur trade and that iconic Mirror front page of a seal being clubbed, which changed the attitudes towards the fur trade in this country. More recently, we have campaigned for a change in the law in organ donation, and we're currently in the middle of a battle on various fronts to approach how this country deals with racism in football. And there's something particular about the way that we campaign, because it's not just about telling people what we think or something that's going on in the chattering classes. Our role is very much about how we change the narrative on important issues in the masses, amongst the masses, people who are our readers, those compassionate, decent people who make up the vast swathes of Britain, but who need to be persuaded about a topic if we're going to see real change in society. So Journalism is an interesting topic. All the journalists I know a little bit about a lot of things. But you can look at that in another way, is we don't know very much about anything. So that's why here today we have some experts who are going to try and help us. Because contrary to a lot of the popular view amongst the populists, we still believe in experts. We still believe in science, and we still believe that there is a role that we should be informed by that. So we're doing a lot of work on climate crisis, and next week we are doing a special edition, so the whole of the Daily Mirror is going to be directed very much onto this topic. But we're also acutely aware that we don't necessarily have the skills and the expertise to do this on our own, which is why we thought, right, what we do need to do is speak to people that do have that skill and that expertise. So that's why we are very grateful that you're here today to help us inform what we put into that special issue and our coverage moving forward. And we're also very grateful to all of you who have come here today to help us do that, because it is by asking those questions and by answering those questions, hopefully, that we will have the information that we need to ensure that we get the right messages across to the masses of Britain who are hungry for information on this, and who, as a result, we will finally see the sufficient action that we need. So now I'm going to hand over to Chris Packham, who, as I'm sure you all know, is the nation's favourite naturalist, not naturist, and environmentalist and award-winning TV presenter. So thank you very much, Chris.
Good afternoon, everyone. I have to say it's a tremendous pleasure to be here. I'm going to pronounce today as a momentous day before we even get started. Who would have thought 5, 10, 15 years ago that a UK tabloid newspaper would be orchestrating and organising an event like this? That is progress, there's no doubt about that. My job today, though, is to be chair. I come to you, well, with what degree of expertise, I'm not sure. I'm certainly a fan of wildlife, a naturalist, a zoologist, an environmentalist, but I'm also today representing the uncooperative crusties of the world, because I'm a firm supporter of Extinction Rebellion. And we have some members of that on our panel today. But we're going to cut straight on. We want to get through a few prescribed questions that we have, some which have come in from readers already, and then we'll chuck the open to the floor and everyone can contribute. Our first duty is a small filmic one, and for that I would like each of the panellists to introduce themselves by name and by profession or description, and then answer one simple question, and that is why the climate issue is everyone's issue, why the climate issue is indeed everyone's issue. So we start at the far end. So if you can introduce yourself, brief précis of your professional place, and then why the climate issue is everyone's issue.
Thank you, Chris. My name's Darren Moorcroft. I'm Chief Executive of the Woodland Trust. This is day 1 of week 5 of being Chief Executive of the Woodland Trust. So everything I say is down to me, as well as probably the Woodland Trust now, so I have to accept that. I think the answer to your question, Chris, is quite a simple one. I think the need has never been greater, the will has never been greater, and the challenge has never been greater. I think we are in a situation where the climate affects everybody and everything. So as a conservationist of over 20 years, I care about nature, and I know that climate change is impacting on that nature that I care about. As a father of 3 children, it will affect the future generations and their future generations of which I care about. I think the reality is that we have to see this unprecedented time that we are in of a climate crisis and a nature crisis as 2 sides of the same coin, and I think we have to address them as such. And I think we have to address them with one eye on both environmental justice and social justice. So that's why it matters to everybody, because everybody should be able to enjoy nature. Everybody should be able to enjoy clean air, clean water, soil which will produce the food of the future. That's why I think it's important to everybody.
Excellent. Mike, can you go next then, please? Just give us a little beat. Happy? Off you go.
My name is Mike Childs. I'm Head of Science Policy and Research at Friends of the Earth. I have been for about 30 years, banging my head against a brick wall alongside many other long-standing campaigners. So it's fantastic to see the Mirror standing up and speaking out on this critically important issue. To me, this is about people. People across the world are already dying because of floods, wildfires, droughts that are made worse by climate change. And even here in the UK, I live in York. York's seen repeated extreme flooding events, and people are in misery because of that, but that's the same across the rest of the country. And we know, the scientists tell us, if we burn more oil, gas and coal, that the situation will get that much worse, and particularly impacting on future generations, but also the poorest around the world who've done the least to cause this problem. The thing for me is, while the issue is evident and in front of us and urgent, the lack of action is baffling, because the solutions are clear. We know how to insulate homes. We know how to run buses and trams affordably and effectively on time. Renewable energy is now cheap. We just need to deliver these things and have the political will to deliver them. And that's where we all come in as citizens, raising our voice, however we do it, whether it's through youth strikes, through Extinction Rebellion, or through other forms of campaigning. We can make a difference, and that's what's keeping me optimistic about the future.
Okay, Holly, you ready to rock?
Hi, my name is Holly Gillibrand. I'm a 14-year-old environmental activist and school climate striker. And I think my perspective from this is that I'm not even out of high school, and yet when I'm 25 years old, climate change will become irreversible. And what we as a species do now, my generation can't undo in the future. And we didn't ask for it. We've been born into a world of environmental crises, and we didn't ask for it, we didn't cause it. But with the school climate strikes, we've decided that we're not going to put up with this anymore, and that we're going to do something about it.
Hello, my name is Natalie Petrelli. I'm a senior scientist at the Zoological Society of London. On top of what has been said, I would say that for me, the issue is that it matters to everyone because we have to do this together. We can't just have a fraction of people doing one thing and the other doing something else. We're going to have to coordinate. And we have to change, and change is difficult. And it's not straightforward. It's not straightforward to change your home, how you heat your home, how you drive your car. If you drive your car, there's a lot of discussion, which means that we're going to have to talk more about how we face change together. And to me, this is a great opportunity to do this today and in the future.
Thanks. My name is Doug Parr. I am the Chief Scientist and Policy Director at Greenpeace and have been for quite a long time. I started writing about climate change nearly 30 years ago. So it's fantastic to see the upwelling of concern that is finally starting to approach the levels that we need to see, because tackling climate change, the impacts of climate change rather, are going to be multiple, they're going to be profound, and they're going to interact, because there will be more heat in places, there will be too much water in places, there will be too little water in places, all of which are foundations for the kind of civilization that we're used to having. And certainly at the bad end of the spectrum, that means that civilization as we know it would break down. So it matters to everybody. It also matters to everybody because tackling it, even from a rich, relatively well-insulated country from some of those impacts, is still going to touch everybody's lives. From how we get around, how we grow food, how we get power, what and how we build, what kind of infrastructure we have, how we use our land, if we use our land, and how much waste, whether we produce waste. All of these things are going to profoundly affect everybody's lives if we're serious about tackling the climate crisis to the level that it needs tackling. We're pleased to see that there is a commitment to zero emissions, net zero emissions. I just want to emphasize at this point, that's really hard. It doesn't mean it can't be done, but it is really hard. And I think the level of will and understanding that we need around those issues to get close to it is quite profound compared to anything we see at the moment.
Hi, I'm Dr. Emily Grossman. I've got a PhD in molecular biology, and I work as a science broadcaster, a science writer, and a science educator. I'm also one of the founding members of a group called Scientists for Extinction Rebellion. We have a declaration statement that's now been signed by over 1,500 top scientists across the globe, pledging support for non-violent direct action against government inaction over the climate and ecological emergency. I think this impacts everyone because what's going on now has never happened before. The climate and ecological emergency is the biggest threat that humanity has ever faced. It's human-caused, and we have to stop making it worse. Or, for the first time, we will face catastrophe that we cannot think our way out of, invent our way out of, or buy our way out of. It will affect 100% of us and everything that we love. The future of our children and our grandchildren is at stake. We have to act now. We have to act radically before it's too late. We can't afford to wait another second.
Tamsin.
I'm Tamsin Edwards. I'm a climate scientist at King's College London. My research area is thinking about the uncertainty in our predictions about future climate change, and particularly what the ice sheets are going to do with respect to sea level rise. For me, as a climate scientist and as a human, the two words that come to mind are irreversibility and injustice. Irreversibility because the West Antarctic ice sheet, which I study, seems to be close to a tipping point of collapse where the IPCC report last year assessed there was a moderate risk of that happening at 1 degree of warming, which is where we are now, and high risk at 2.5 degrees. The loss of an ice sheet, which is 3.3 meters of sea level rise, is not something that you can undo on any meaningful human timescale. Species that are under severe human pressures, multiple human pressures, could be irreversibly lost. Something like reef building, coral in the tropical warm waters, we're at risk between 1.5 to 2 degrees of warming, of losing between 90 and 99% of those. And injustice, because although everyone in this room might personally be okay with climate change, we can have our air conditioning on a hot day and we can live in a city like London that is well protected from sea level rise. The climate change effects around the world, as we've heard. Sorry, I'm shaking because I have some fatigue at the moment, so sorry for the distraction. The climate change impacts that we'll see in the world are going to affect the most vulnerable, and we know that we cannot help them adapt to everything. And under the very highest emissions predictions of the end of the century, there are parts of the world that may reach thresholds of combined temperature and humidity which are then intolerable for even fit humans to be outside for more than a few hours. Now, what that means in terms of adaptation is difficult to say, and I hope and think that we won't reach those level of emissions. But if we, in this room, in a well-off country, can't care about people in other parts of the world and in the future, then what kind of humans are we?
Thank you very much. Just before we move on to some questions, I'm going to ask you, each of you at the end, for a demand, a simple demand that we could make today that, if satisfied, would make a pretty instantaneous difference tomorrow and would lead to positive change. So have that in your minds as you're listening to your colleagues. Holly, I'm going to start with you. The question that's come in is, why is climate change an issue that matters greatly to young people? I think you answered that, actually, in your first statement. But the second part of the question is, what is your message to those who don't think that your message, the youth message, is important? What would you say to those people, as frankly as you can?
That's quite a difficult question.
I've seen you on Twitter, Holly. You speak your mind. Don't hold back.
I think that people need to remember that we are the future adults. We are the future politicians, the future not change makers, the future decision makers, and we are also the generation that is going to be impacted most by this. And so we have as much right to have a say as anyone, maybe, I don't know, probably not even more. But our voice matters. And with the school strikes, we've seen that when you've got millions of young people coming out and telling the world that what they think and that this is important, then change does happen. We've had the climate emergency declarations, and we've had the, I can't think of any specific ones right now, but policies coming through in governments that won't change a lot, but they are progress. For example, we've had the suspension on fracking. In Scotland, where I live, we've had the complete ban of fracking. And so these are just small examples of what can happen when you get large numbers of people coming out and sharing their opinion. And in this instance, it's the youth that are doing that.
Holly, tell me what happens when you wake up every Friday morning, come hell or high water in Fort William, so that's mainly high water, and your alarm goes off and you get up and you're going to take part in your climate strike. How do you feel? Are you motivated by disappointment, frustration, anger? Because something compels you to do that. You've done it every week without fail. I see your photographs. So what's your motivation there?
I think this is probably a bad word in today's society, but love, because my love for the natural world and for my friends and my family, and I think that's what drives me, because it's very difficult if you have like an emotion such as anger and frustration. Those are important, but it's very hard to keep sustaining that. But I think love is one very, very powerful emotion that makes you never give up and keeps you determined that you're going to keep doing what you're doing and you're not going to give up.
I don't think we could applaud all the answers, but that one certainly deserves some. Tamsin, we're going to move on. I've got a question here. You work for or with the IPCC, the International Panel for Climate Change. What is your view of climate change deniers, and how do we continue to take them on?
That's a great question. I'm right, thanks. So the IPCC is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change that writes these great big reports. I'm working on the next one, which isn't out for another couple of years yet, year and a half. Contrary to what people might assume, we're not paid for that. It's an evenings and weekends job. It's a really interesting question, and I have some personal friends who are climate skeptics, who wouldn't say that the impacts of future climate change are serious enough to warrant the kind of large-scale action we've been talking about to meet the Paris Agreement. And I think, to some extent, there's been some shift in people's views. I think that we do have to tackle some climate change, that we do have to make some of these changes, but we can't understand how people are thinking about that problem unless we listen to them. And that's something that I try actively to do. I don't always succeed. But to understand what it is it, is it some particular policy? Is it some particular priority they want to tackle poverty instead more directly? And that's the only way. We can't be belligerent. We can't throw facts at them and assume that will work. We can't get angrier and angrier. Ultimately, we have to listen, and we have to try to bring people with us with things like the co-benefits of adapting to climate change or mitigating emissions. Not relying on fossil fuels, which we know are going to run out, not emitting so much air pollution, which we know is bad for us, protecting species which we know are good for supporting our life on the planet. So I think we just have to listen rather than shout.
Occasionally, though, mischief is undoubtedly at play. We've seen with Extinction Rebellion a think tank report that was put together that described us all as anarchists, I think, and politically malevolence. But it was paid for by people with a vested interest in not changing climate policies. So that is something which is quite insidious and potentially dangerous. How do you think we should go about approaching those people?
Well, obviously, all of this has become really deeply rooted in identity and cultural identity and identity politics and people's values, as well as the vested interest aspect that people talk about. And I think I think, what we have to do is we have to tackle misinformation about science, which can come from all directions. I think we have to keep plugging away with the co-benefits, as we call them, the extra benefits of what we're doing. The ways in which the world can be cleaner, can be cheaper, energy can be cheaper, and so forth. And I think actually, my feeling is that there is movement, that people are really saying, well, there is climate change and we are going to do something about it, and now talking about the policies rather than saying, is it happening and should we do anything at all? So I am more optimistic about that. I do think there's been some movement.
There is still a flat Earth society,
That's a whole different story.
Yes, I'm afraid it is. Emily, your question. Has Extinction Rebellion succeeded in its goals so far? And what do you say to those who think that on occasion it's been counterproductive? I suppose one of those examples might be when people reacted very negatively to the people who were climbing on the tube trains.
Yeah, that's a very good question. So first of all, has it been successful so far? So let's be clear that none of the actual demands of Extinction Rebellion have been met or have been anywhere close to be met. However, the presence of Extinction Rebellion, I think we can have no doubt, has raised huge awareness about this crisis, this emergency that we are facing as humanity. It has really changed the kind of where it sits on the map in terms of the media, in terms of politics, even though our demands have not been met, in terms of just general awareness of people on the street or at home watching or at home listening. Even if that awareness is simply to ask questions, to want to know more, to seek answers, or to kind of protest against the modes that have been used, I would say there is no doubt that in the past years, particularly in the past 6 months, that where we sit, where climate change and the ecological crisis sits on the map of awareness has completely changed. The climate and ecological crisis is now up there in the top 3 of things that everyday people are most concerned about in terms of their life and their existence here in the UK. And that's a huge, huge shift. It's also massively changed in terms of the reporting. I know that's something we're here partly to also help with today, but in terms of the way the media are reporting on climate crisis, on biodiversity loss, on the coverage it's getting, on the conversations that are being had, there's been a massive, massive change. That said, the demands of Extinction Rebellion, for those who perhaps are not aware, are that governments, and in this case the media too, tell the truth about the extent to which this is an emergency and just how bad it is. And there is no doubt that that is still not happening. Yes, it is getting better, and it's getting better in the media, in some media, but there is no doubt that this is not happening. Because if everybody really knew, if everyone really, really knew, and I think probably people on this panel and probably in this room are pretty much there with this, but if everybody really knew just how bad it was, just how urgently we need to act, and just what consequences would happen to our lives, to the lives of our family, our loved ones, and to poorer people, people in less advantaged countries across the world, if they really knew what is happening and what will happen, we would be doing more. More people would be on the streets. More people, like myself, and I imagine people here, would be having sleepless nights going, this can't happen, what are we going to do? And until that happens, I think it's clear that the truth is not being told. The second demand being to bring global UK greenhouse gas emissions down to net zero by 2025. Now, some people have said that this is a very difficult thing to do. There is no doubt that this would be a very difficult thing to do. The mitigation rates would have to be super high. We would require, pretty much a sort of almost like a wartime mobilization and change, a radical change to our society. However, that is now what is needed for us to stand even a reasonable chance of having a sustainable future, of preventing societal collapse, loss of food, loss of clean drinking water, and thousands, millions, if not billions, of loss of life. Now, of course, this is all risk. There is no absolute here. We cannot say, if we don't do this, this will happen. But it's pretty unequivocal. Climate scientists across the world are agreeing that this really does need to be done. So, is it working? The awareness is building, but the demands are not being met. Just for the record, the third demand being to call in a citizens' assembly to let everyday people decide on how we as a community, as a society, are going to move forward with making the radical changes that need to be made in order to secure our futures and that of our children and grandchildren. But in answer to the question of the modes of action, again, there has been a lot of talk about this. There's been a lot of controversy about this. I need to stress here that Extinction Rebellion, I think one of its great qualities is that it is a decentralized movement. It is a movement in which people adhere to what are 10 values and to the 3 demands. But outside of that, people are free to take actions that they want to do that feel aligned with or appropriate to the level of urgency that we are now in. I must say, and it's been publicly said, that a lot, if not a vast majority of those individuals who align themselves with Extinction Rebellion did not agree with some of the actions that were taken, including the action on the tube. However, there were individuals that felt that that was proportional to the impact that we're going to have in our society. And I think what we can look at, what we can ask, is to say, well, yes, you know, some might say, okay, let's take more public transport. Blocking public transport isn't a useful thing to do here. I personally agree. However, there is no doubt that if we don't take radical action, and it's not being taken, there's a lot of people who are very upset, who are very angry, who are experiencing climate grief, who are experiencing real impacts of feeling the enormity every single day of how huge this issue is and that hasn't been brought to the public attention. And that if we look at how society will be in 10, 15, 20, 30, certainly by the end of the century, if we don't take radical action now, then the sorts of things that even a sort of extreme version of people who are aligned and knowing this truth, the sort of things that they might do, are really not out of proportion with the impact that we will be facing as a society here in terms of potential food strikes, not food strikes, food hikes, people who are not getting enough food, civil unrest, conflict. You know, imagine a world where we can't get tubes and trains to work because the infrastructure breaks down. Imagine the world where we don't have enough to eat, where people are fighting in the streets to feed their children. You know, this is a real reality of what we're moving towards. So yes, I agree. Some of the types of action may be problematic for some people and huge disruption, but I would really beg us to look at the disruption to our lives that is going to take place if we don't take the kind of radical action that movements like Extinction Rebellion and the Friday school strikes are calling for and are simply not being seen.
Okay, Doug, Emily stuck true to her mission and told us the truth. It's not a pretty one. Very often I think there's a danger that the climate crisis, as large and existential as it is, overwhelms people. It diminishes their ability to empower themselves to actually believe that they as individuals can make a difference. So what can we do as individuals, both personally and politically?
So I think there is this tendency, and I think it's an unhelpful tendency, to see the climate crisis as something that people have to take individual responsibility for. You know, that somehow if they recycle a bit more, that's the thing that they can do. And of course it's worthwhile. And of course I would not absolutely suggest to anybody that they shouldn't, walk instead of taking the car, or walk or cycle, that they shouldn't make sure that they minimize their waste in the first instance, not just recycle stuff. Be careful where they go on holiday, be careful about what they eat to minimize their emissions, etc. All of these things are valuable in and of themselves. But there is, for me, a profound distinction between that kind of activity and allowing expansion at Heathrow, which the government is currently planning to do. Because every little individual thing that everybody in the country could do would be wiped off and more by one stroke of a pen from a Secretary of State or, in effect, the Prime Minister. And so there is the role of the individual. And people should do that partly because of charges of hypocrisy, but also because we are moral beings, I mean, the very centre of the climate issue is one of justice, that we are, firstly, that, that the the impacts are being unfairly visited on largely those from the global south, whereas it's a problem that's been caused by the global north. There is an issue of injustice in that the sort of changes that we can see could be profoundly mishandled in the way that our exit from coal in the UK was mishandled. And we have got some fairly big industries where this is going to happen again. But what it does mean is that the big choices that need to be made are those that are going to be made by governments who have the authority and power to make them. And so it is the political activity sitting alongside the things that we want to do as moral humans that are the ones that are going to be most impactful. I mean, you'd expect me to say that. I'm part of a pressure group, but I think any kind of, understanding of the budgets and numbers and where they sit means that that's the road you have to take. The steel industry is not going to decarbonise. The steel industry, the cement industry, the chemical industry, the glass industry, they are not going to decarbonise by individual action. It is going to happen by, R&D, regulation, and other tools that government can offer.
So Doug, the key thing is we can do our bit personally, and it's empowering, and it makes us feel good, and we're contributing.
And it's the right thing to do.
No, but it's not enough.
It's not enough.
So actively what we can do. We've got an election coming.
Yeah.
So surely this is a time when the cross in the box needs to count for the environment.
Yeah, sure. So we will, Greenpeace, I and a colleague or two, will be ranking the manifestos. And we will be able to tell well before polling day if climate is the thing that you want to do, that is your determining thing, climate and nature, I should say, is the determining thing about your vote, we will have the information there.
So is Greenpeace going to tell us where the best vote goes for the environment?
We are going to put the information out there and people can make their mind up. But I'm pretty sure I don't know. I mean, I haven't seen the manifestos yet. None of them have been published. But I think people will be able to make their own minds up when they see the information out there and how we rank them on I think we've got 16 criteria, which will condense down to about 5. But anyway, there'll be stuff that people can look at and make their judgments about. I have a feeling, actually, that there's another project going on which these school strikers might be involved with too. So there'll be information available for people wanting to do that.
So guidance is coming from Greenpeace, basically.
Yes.
Excellent, thank you. Mike, Emily has been quite forthright on the potential impacts of our climate crisis on the human species. Let's take it to the environment now. We're part of nature. Some people say that, we're dependent on nature. They forget that we're actually part of it. What are the likely impacts UK-wise on the environment and its biodiversity, should we see the predictions coming true?
Well, as you say, we're inextricably linked, which is why Friends of the Earth has always had a view of looking after people and looking after the environment are two sides of the same coin. You can't look after the environment unless you look after people, and you can't look after people without looking after the environment. I mean, in the UK, we will see loss of species. We're already seeing that anyway. There's huge amounts of habitat damage and intensive farming, which is also contributing to climate change, has already wiped out large amounts of species or diminished the numbers of them significantly. We see sea level rise will further exacerbate and damage potentially the salt marshes around the UK, important for carbon storage, but also incredibly important for people. And if you look around the coastline, we can see that, as I said, I live in York. I go across to the cliffs near Flamborough and Filey every year and see the bird life there. It is absolutely amazing, but you're already seeing diminishing numbers of puffins around that area as the seas are warming, the sand eels are moving further north. So you're seeing impacts on bird life there as well.
I'm going to play devil's advocate now and say that if puffins disappear, it's going to really upset me because I'm very passionate about birds. But many people in the audience will say, I can live without puffins. I don't need puffins. But we do, don't we? We need that balanced, functional, sustainable ecosystem.
Yes, we do. I mean, puffins are beautiful, and we're human beings who also love beauty. And one of the things that inspired me to be an environmentalist so many years ago was one of Dave Attenborough's first TV series, Life on Earth, which showed the wonders of the rainforest, as amongst other places as well. And the sheer beauty of this planet is worth protecting in its own right. So that's why we need to protect the puffin as well, because we're a species that can enjoy beauty. But yes, we live in ecosystems that are intricate webs, and you pull apart parts of that ecosystem. We don't quite know when it will fall apart, but it will begin to unravel and fall apart. So whilst in some parts of the world, if you lose the coral reefs, immense beauty, people's livelihoods depend directly on those coral reefs for their subsistence of their food. Or you lose the Amazon, and suddenly use the rainwater recycling done by the Amazon, and you get droughts further, in the States and elsewhere in South America as well. So we're intrinsically connected to nature. We are part of nature, and that's true here in the UK as overseas. But you can't protect UK wildlife and ignore the rest of the overseas as though they're separate things. We have to look after nature wherever it is around the world.
Natalie, that brings me to yourself. Since 1970, we've lost between 40 and 50% of the world's wildlife. It's a bit careless, isn't it? I mean, I feel ashamed that having been a conservationist that long, on my watch, we have collectively failed so badly. So tell us a little bit about the global impact of that loss, and perhaps how it might impact on us as a species. But also, let's start moving in another direction now and talking about some of the positive aspects, because we do have the means to restore, repair, reintroduce that wildlife, don't we?
Yeah, I think what's important to understand that when we think about climate change and nature and the ecological crisis is that everything is connected. The loss of wildlife reduces our ability to mitigate the impact of climate change and to adapt to climate change. And so the more we lose that buffer, the more we dig our grave. So the question is, how do we work better with nature? And the more we lose, the less we're doing so effectively. We have had the tendency to try to get ourselves out of problems through engineering and through solution, which sometimes works. But in the situation like climate change, actually nature provides some really good solution. I think what's interesting also to understand is that climate change interacts with other things that we do. So we change the land, we pollute, and all of that work together, which puts added pressure, interacting pressure on wildlife. And again, we lose wildlife, or wildlife move, because climate change doesn't systematically mean extinction. Sometimes it just means species moving around, which is why we start to have ticks coming more and more in the UK and the disease that goes with it, which is why we have malaria slowly coming back in Europe. So climate change means that species don't have much choice. They can either die, move, or do well because the conditions are improving for them. But that's a minority of species. But it's true that we are not, we don't have to have the future that we are carving for ourselves. There are solutions, there are things we can do, and we don't have to continue to lose wildlife. There's actually a way to bring back wildlife or to work with wildlife for wildlife to do better. And so we can restore, but it's quite important to understand that climate change is changing things in a way where we can't bring back what was there before because it's just simply not suitable. So which means that we might have new ecosystem, new wildlife coming in new areas. And that's okay. Nature does change. The point is to try to work with it, to let it to a point where it can find a new stable a new stable equilibrium, which works for us and for society in general.
Thank you. And Darren, moving on to those positive things we can do that will benefit us and wildlife and the environment. Yesterday I spent a soggy Sunday working with the Woodland Trust, making a programme for Channel 5 in trying to raise £150,000 to plant 100,000 trees. Now, trees have been in the news, haven't they, as obviously through rewilding. We want a better structure for our ecosystems. But part and parcel of that, in the last few months at least, people have been talking about the need to reforest the UK in terms of its carbon capture. We've got about 13% forest cover in the UK, as opposed to 30% in most of Western Europe. We're one of the most deforested countries, certainly in Europe. But if we can get more trees in the ground, better for the environment, good for carbon capture, good for pollution, all sorts of things.
Absolutely, Chris, and you probably all said it all, but what I would say is the 13% is both a travesty and an opportunity. So you mentioned that in Europe, the average is approximately 38% woodland cover, and we're at 13%. The Climate Change Committee report said we should be aspiring to 17 to 19% by 2050. Now, you may argue that that's not soon enough, and we would want it to be sooner, but that's 1.5 billion trees. And as you would imagine, as I sit here, I think about the value that those trees will play in changing the nature of land in the UK. And it won't simply be carbon capture. It will be delivering some of the things that we've heard about from other panellists, including the nature recovery that we want to see. It will be the flood alleviation to help us to withstand some of the impacts that we are going to see with climate change of heavier rainfall events. It's the shade that we need in places like London, but everywhere else, in order for us to have a better ability to survive in the heat of the extremes of the summer, and as well as the air pollution that we are experiencing at the moment. You know, the air pollution in Delhi is in the news at the moment. It can't be that far away for us to be thinking about, actually, with 2,000 premature deaths in the UK down to air pollution, we should be doing more. And one of the things that we know that trees do, alongside all of those other benefits, is take the particulates out of the air. And we've seen those particulates dropping in and around some of the schools that we've been had the privilege to plant new hedges and trees with.
Okay, I'm going to move on now to a couple of other questions. Try and whiz through as many people as possible. The question is, should we all give up flying, eating red meat, driving completely? You start there. I mean, I think the thing is that, you know, I've been vegan for a year. One of the biggest problems I've faced are the didactic ultra-vegans, because I've still got leather shoes on, and they're absurd shoes at that. But the key thing is, isn't it about us moving in a positive direction? And from your point of view personally, what stance do you take on these issues, which are, you know, a few years ago we would have thought nothing of, but now there are ethical and moral decisions to be made by all of us as individuals?
Absolutely, and I suppose lifestyle changes we absolutely need to do. So whilst I say we should plant more trees, we need to change the way in which we live our lives as well. And so personally, I think I am eating more vegetarian diet during the week. I still eat meat. I eat what I would suggest to be good quality meat from with provenance that I know of, but I know that I'm in a privileged position to do that. So. And also I'm in a privileged position to now moving away from a petrol-based car to an electric car. And so personally, I'm in the process of looking at which electric car I'm best suited for my lifestyle and having to travel around the country. I thought about a hybrid, but it kind of felt like it wasn't going far enough. But again, I'm in a privileged position to be able to make that choice. So I wouldn't impose it on others, but I would suggest that everybody should be thinking about the contributions that they're able to make. And also, I have the opportunity to plant some trees on the 30th of November as part of the Big Climate Fight Back, which, Chris, you mentioned you were helping us with yesterday. With that opportunity, I should take it. So I suppose my overall message is our lifestyles do need to change, and the opportunities that we have, we must take, because we can't just sit and wait for other people to do it on our behalf.
Okay, Mike, then I'll come to Doug as well. What are we going to do about this flying issue? Some people have got used to flying, taking taxis effectively from one part of the country to another, going on holiday several times a year. Well, how do we face that on a personal, ethical level?
On a personal level, I think we need to try as much as possible align what we do in our own lives with what we want to call for politically if we're calling for action on climate change. I think it's very difficult to say. Personally, I think climate change and nature degradation is a issue of fundamental importance for the future of humanity, and at the same time eat loads of red meat, fly everywhere and drive everywhere. So the reality is I think people will have to think about that and reduce their flights. But that said, there is also the reality that the vast bulk of flights are multiple flights by the most wealthy in society. So I'm not going to stand here and say some family who is working hard, not paid very much, really hard-pressed, can't go on a family holiday abroad every year. I'm lucky I can afford, me and my partner and children, to take the long train journeys through to Slovenia the other year and Poland a couple of years ago, but they're much more expensive than flying. So we also need to bear in mind the reality of where we're at. I think we will have to do as much as we can to align our behaviours to our political calling. But those people who repeatedly fly throughout the year, predominantly wealthy people, then I think we need to see the introduction of a frequent flyer levy to put the price up considerably, to price them off doing that, and we have to cancel the expansion at Heathrow, as Doug mentioned, but also across the rest of the country where airports are striving to increase capacity. We need to reduce emissions from flying dramatically, and that a large part of that will be about personal action. But as Doug rightfully said earlier, a large part of that is about political action. So I don't think you can separate out the what you do in your lifestyle from what you do politically. I think they both have to be aligned.
Holly, you travelled from Fort William in Scotland on the overnight sleeper train. Was that a conscious decision not to fly? I mean, I know there's not an airport at Fort William, but you could have gone from Inverness. Was that a decision that you've made based upon that?
Yeah, I think that right now I'm in a position where I think I need to do everything I can, and avoiding flying is one of them. But the problem at the moment is that flying is cheaper, whereas getting the overnight train costs maybe a couple of £100, maybe a bit more. And so
clearly your mum paid. We'll let you off on this.
But we can't tell people who aren't as fortunate as ourselves to stop flying, because right now flying is the cheapest option and it gets them to where they need to go. So definitely we need political change on this, because yes, we can't just tell people to stop flying when that's really sometimes the only alternative for them.
Doug, what about carbon offsetting? I carbon offset. Is my conscience clean?
I wouldn't. I take a view that carbon offsetting is sometimes not even a sticking plaster. It is actually not the right thing to be doing. Now, I have to be careful here, because money that is set aside for offsetting can be dedicated to projects that are doing good. I don't want to diminish that for a moment. But as soon as you start saying, yeah, here is some money that we've put aside for, well, typically planting trees as a way of dealing with your flight, then I think that the risk there is that there's an abdication of responsibility. Take responsibility for your own emissions. So, private jets are not okay if you plant a few trees. Because one of the things we do need to emphasize when we're looking at the massive scale of change that we need is that the ability of the biosphere, so all on nature, all reforestation and so on, the ability of that system to soak up carbon isn't infinite. It is limited. And we should not be frittering away that valuable ability to pull carbon from the atmosphere into the biosphere on frivolous flying. And therefore, there is no substitute for getting out of fossil fuels. There is no substitute for people choosing the right thing and not the wrong thing, where they have the ability and capacity to do so. And the idea that throwing some money at a eucalyptus plantation somewhere in Africa somehow makes that okay is just, in my estimation, completely wrong. I emphasize it is possible that carbon offsetting has done some good in some places at some times, but a lot of it hasn't. And so, for example, the way this was supposed to be institutionalized internationally was something called a clean development mechanism. It was estimated that 80% of those projects actually delivered zero benefit. It is very difficult to get carbon offsetting right. And in any case, even if it is using the biosphere, it's not the right way to be behaving when a personal decision to emit less should have been taken.
Tamsin, you want to jump in there?
Yeah, thanks. I guess I've been trying to get across an idea that I think isn't super well known, which kind of relates to this, which is kind of about the global offset, if you like. Because there's this term net zero gets bandied around, and I think we often don't explain what that means. So we're not talking about zero emissions by 2050 or by whatever date that someone is, different groups and political parties are going for. We're talking about net zero emissions, which means we know that we cannot cut all emissions, and flying is going to be probably one of them for some time to come. And so the net zero part means we must be extracting CO2 from the air as we emit it. And of course, the classic machine for doing that is a tree, and they're very good at it. And we've always thought of it as offsetting, but the other way we can think of it is negative CO2 emissions. That's the sort of jargon that gets used, carbon dioxide removal. But I think what hasn't really been talked about enough is the scale of the thing, and it's been hinted at a bit with land use. If we're going to meet the Paris Agreement target of 1.5 degrees of warming, the estimates of the IPCC report last year are that we need up to, so there are two main methods at the moment that we know how to do that through plants and crops. There's planting trees, and there's planting crops to use as biofuels, which we then use as biofuels and capture the CO2 and lock it into the ground, or other methods. And both of those have the net effect of taking CO2 out of the air. But to do that on the scale that we need, knowing how quickly we can cut our emissions, we would need up to 27% of global agricultural land to be put aside for forests and biofuel crops. That's 11% of the global land area. Now, the consequences of that for food security and living, livelihoods are immense. And there are ways to do it that are better than others in terms of using wastelands and degraded land so that you prevent soil erosion and things. But that's what's required. And we don't have a good scalable way to do this carbon dioxide removal right now. We know the benefits of trees, and they have lots of co-benefits. We know that we can just about do this bioenergy stuff, although we don't have it anything like the scale. We basically don't have any at the moment. There's technological solutions that may be on the horizon of chemically trapping CO2 from the air. At the moment, they're too expensive and too energy intensive. I think the states in the US, they're throwing a lot of money at it because it's, again, a kind of a get-out clause, if you like, for continuing emissions. But that's the scale of the challenge that is not really talked about, I think, enough.
Okay. Briefly, Emily, because I want to throw questions to the floor after this, but you gave us your prophecies, and they're terrifying, and they're realistic, of course. We know that. You've told us the truth. As a consequence of those, we're going to see increases in food prices. We're going to see more pressure on the land to grow that food to keep the prices down. We're going to see droughts, which are going to instigate migrations. We're going to see political turmoil. With that comes potential for conflict. There's a cost here, and there are two costs that I think, just briefly talk about the two costs. One is that, therefore, the human, the planetary cost, if you like, and the other is the cash cost. Because if we do aim to meet any of these targets, it's going to hit us in the pocket as individuals, isn't it?
Well, that's the thing, is that it's kind of this offsetting in terms of human life, right? It's like, yes, there's going to have to be a huge change. There's going to have to be a huge change on a human level to the way we live our lives, and there's going to have to be a huge input, as you say, financially into bringing about the sorts of change on the sort of like global scale kind of mobilization that is needed across the world and here in the UK to make that happen. But it's about weighing it up, it's about saying, okay, well, yeah, that's going to be hard. But if we're really realistic about the kind of world that we are moving towards, kind of careering towards, if we don't bring about those changes, then it's kind of like saying, well, okay, well, it's going to be a bit expensive now, but I mean, the Governor of the Bank of England, Mark Carney, has basically said that we're heading towards financial instability, and by the time we get there, it's going to be too late. And the UN Secretary General has said we're looking at a real existential threat here. This is not just climate scientists, although obviously we should be listening to climate scientists. This is also the top names across the UK and globally who are saying that this is this bad. And yes, that it will take a big financial outlay, but the consequences in terms of financial instability that's going to happen as soon as the prices start to go up on food, as you said. Top insurance companies have also said that we're looking at a world where extreme weather is going to get so common that the world is simply going to be uninsurable. So we're already looking across the globe at billions and billions of pounds worth of damage annually for extreme weather, for droughts, for floods, for sea level rise, for cyclones. That's already happening. And insurance companies are simply not going to be able to insure such situations. There are insurance companies who are already saying that they're going to stop insuring basements in cities like London and New York and other international cities because of the threats to flooding from freak storms, but also from sea level rise. So it's a sort of cost-benefit analysis, if that's the right phrase to use. I'm not an economist at all myself. But I mean, it makes complete nonsense to say, well, it's going to cost a lot of money and it's going to cause a lot of disruption to our lives when we're thinking 10, 20, 30, 40 years, certainly by the end of the century, we're looking at potential complete financial collapse and deaths of millions, if not billions of people. What more is there to say? That's my take.
Stop there. Lastly, Natalie, is there space for other life on Earth? And we've heard about the impacts. We know that we have a growing human population at the moment as well, which is something that we haven't touched upon. All of that biodiversity loss, all of the climate change, the pressure on the natural world, excluding our species, although we know we're intrinsically linked with it, is phenomenal at this point in time.
Yeah, it is phenomenal. And but I think that there are things we can do to get better at living with wildlife. We've been very good at separating ourselves from wildlife and not connecting with wildlife and not see the value of wildlife to the point where we had to create a framework to value wildlife again. So this is about coexistence somehow, coexistence with other life form. How do you develop? And it doesn't mean that one needs to override all the other. There is possibility to have a mutual interaction and actually mutual benefits and synergies, which a lot of animals do all the time. So to be a bit more concrete, whenever we decide to exclude wildlife from our home, from our garden, from every single space where we do not try to find solutions that work for both, is where we slowly but surely eat that biodiversity. And that's probably one of the discussions that we may need to have as of not only how much we impact the climate, but and that's why the ecological crisis and the climate crisis are linked, but how we can think about our activity so that we think about that sustainability, which means keeping that those species with us, if it makes sense.
Thank you very much. Okay, let's open it to the floor. Who's got a question? Okay, this gentleman here. Direct it if you will. Other than that, we'll pass it around.
It's just for everyone. My name is Ivan D'Ambrosa. I work in sustainability. Thank you very much for your comments. But everything you're saying is very much on the tragedy of the effects of climate change, and I'm not denying it, and punishment that will come from actions that we have to take. Essentially, you are just presenting it as something extremely bad that is going to happen, and the fact that in the end I will be punished because I will have to reduce my flights, I will have to eat less meat, and so on. From a marketing point of view, I believe that working in sustainability, we should really try to represent it. Instead of saying tragedy, 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 let's try to shift it in a way of we can do better, which is going to be good for everyone. Instead of talking about punishment, 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 we try new ways that, for example, will improve your fitness. So whatever we are saying is correct, but the way we are presenting it will just create denial.
Okay.
Yeah, I just want to say thank you for raising that. I couldn't agree more. And I think what we've been doing here, I think, is making sure that people know the truth in order for there to be impetus to act. But I couldn't agree more that actually what we're moving towards is, I think, on all levels, a far better, far happier and far healthier society. I mean, if you look at it, loneliness is one of the biggest problems that we have in Western society today. Loneliness, stress, anxiety. Suicide is the biggest killer of men under the age of 40. There is so much mental health challenges, and a lot of that has been put down to these fragmented, isolated lifestyles that we live in. We've lost communities, we've lost the community vibe, and actually you're absolutely right. I think what we really need to be presenting is what a beautiful society we could be moving towards if we actually become different, sustainable in a different way. We create communities that are not so isolated and fragmented, which necessarily is going to be the case if we travel less or if we rely less on certain technologies. But actually, what would a greener future look like? How beautiful could that be? And how much more love and connection and relationship could there be in that society, and how much our mental health as a result could be so much more positive. So that's my take on that.
Natalie?
Yeah, I think, in conservation, we start to have conservation psychologists, because it has been completely acknowledged that this is not systematically the right people. They are not well equipped to actually help change. Because how you get people to change, it has nothing to do with bombarding them with fact and punishment and stuff, etc. I think that's a nice transition that we see, at least in conservation and hopefully in a lot of different sciences, as to take on board experts in how to create change, to motivate people to change, to see the opportunity instead of seeing the tragedy. And that's an interdisciplinary stuff, which is why I really think that this is about talking together, because we need more marketing experts in climate change. We need more conservation psychologists. We need more people that have expertise to slowly bring everyone together to that change, so that people feel empowered and want to change.
New healthcare niche there then, climate psychologist. Opportunity. Darren?
Thank you for your question. I think thinking of it from the perspective of land use, so having in my dim distant past kind of managed a farm, I think when I look at those figures in terms of 11% or 27% land use change, they don't frighten me. I think actually you look at things like integrating agroforestry into the way that we produce our food productivity goes up. Our ability to manage the land better is a real opportunity, and I think I agree with you. I think we have to be portraying solutions, and we have to be portraying hope, and I think we have those solutions in a lot of the cases. We are up against some those who would wish to market the opposite view and the kind of despair or the fact that those solutions won't make a big enough difference. I kind of challenge them on that. I think actually shifting land use, which makes better use of that land, which captures more carbon, produces more food, gets better animal welfare, and all of those various other things I've mentioned previously, I think is a realistic solution, both in the UK, for which we can then show leadership on a global scale, but also then when you take it to places where things like trees are increasing the productive capacity in Africa for people to be able to feed themselves. Fundamentally, they are solutions that we have in our back pocket. And my biggest frustration is if somebody had come to me yesterday and said, I've invented this thing that does all of these things, and it's a tree and nobody's ever heard of it, people would be falling over themselves to invest in something which was a massive climate change success. And unfortunately, we've had it for far too long, and people have lost sight of the value that it gives us.
Okay, next question. Okay, gentleman over here.
Hi, how you doing? Fergal McEntee from, I'm an Extinction Rebellion Engineers, Greenpeace, Friends of the Earth.
Woodland Trust.
My girlfriend's in the Woodland Trust. I'm a renewable engineer and have been for a long time. And I had to stop working in this country because the oil and gas industry in this country gets huge subsidies. And it gets more subsidies than the renewables, and it's such an unfair playing field that we got. And oil and gas is booming. The amount of money that they're investing in oil technology is unbelievable. And we're in this climate crisis at the moment, and the scale of engineering solutions that we need to do to retrofit like over 20 million properties in this country is huge. We need to rip up all the roads, we need to put in district heating systems, we need to put in heat pumps. And then when it comes to carbon capture and storage, we've got technology that doesn't even exist. And you look at it from an engineering point of view, and we need to be having these conversations now. We're up against the likes of the BBC, who don't even properly report what's actually going on. So we need to try and clean up the UK, and I suppose it's to Doug and Tamsin areas of expertise in this. But we need help to actually get this done.
Yeah, Doug, tell us about the scale of those. Do you want to start, Mike? Tell us about the scale of those subsidies. Let's put that in some sort of context then.
Well, we're talking about billions, and this is tens of billions, and this has been reported repeatedly by the International Energy Authority, and internationally, governments have pledged to reduce these subsidies, but failed to do so largely. But this gets back to an earlier question where I want to add on to what Emily was saying, whereas, Chris, you asked, this is going to cost a lot of money, isn't it? And Emily rightfully said, well, the costs of climate change far outweigh anything you might spend here. But we're wasting money on the wrong things. So you're right, oil and gas subsidies are one example of that. We're spending £90 billion on HS2, a train line that in its own figures show we won't save any carbon dioxide. The government's spending money on the biggest roads building programme across the country, including, for example, bypass in Arundel, going through ancient woodlands, the same as HS2 is going through as well. And if you switch some of that money into doing the right things, you'd have an enormous impact straight away. That kind of expenditure on HS2 and on roads, if that went into public transport and better cycling, segregated cycling ways, we'd have the best public transport system in the world, and we'd be able to give free bus travel to everybody. So sometimes the money does make the world go round, and pointing it in the right direction. So not necessarily about saying you need to tax people loads more. We just need to stop spending money on the wrong things and start spending them on the right things. Come to
Doug. Doug, can you tell me, because I genuinely don't understand, why one of the most lucrative and profitable industries in the world, i.e. the petrochemical industries, needs subsidy of any kind?
Well, they don't. They don't, right? So, I mean, globally, if you look at subsidies, it's a slightly more complicated picture because some of the subsidies are not in the UK, I hasten to add, but they're subsidies for petrol and diesel and people using their cars, and that's a more complicated picture. It is not complicated in the UK. We have principally tax benefits that work for oil and gas extraction. And if I can preemptively answer your final question, the thing that we need to do is stop oil and gas extraction, and we need to stop exploring for it right now, not tomorrow, right now, because we already have more than enough to deliver a 1.5 degrees centigrade rise, and that's before you strip out the coal. But the scale of what we need to do is profound, and I agree with, sorry, it was Adrian, was it? Fergal, that this is a vast engineering task, which also interestingly means it's a vast employment opportunity. And the trick is going to be to shift, because this transition is not going to happen without justice somewhere embedded deeply within it. And there are people who are going to be put out of work by this transition because there are people in garages up and down the land whose specialism is in the internal combustion engine. There are people down the East Coast and some on the West Coast whose jobs are in oil and gas extraction. I could go on. There are plenty of other sectors where they are dependent on it. But there is a huge employment opportunity using some of the same skills, but a retraining program is absolutely necessary, where we can transition to doing the right things on buildings, transport, power, land, instead of doing the wrong things. And, I'm profoundly sorry for all those big shareholders in the oil and gas majors who are going to lose out as a consequence of this. But I'm sorry, you're going to have to. Whereas those people who are at the who are potentially on the receiving end, I think society and governments need to look after. And we can do that.
Just one sentence answer on, they don't require the subsidy and the tax breaks, so why are we giving it to them?
Because there's been a history of embeddedness within government and petrochemical and fossil fuels.
Just a one-word answer, Doug, rather than the sentence.
I mean, corruption is a very loaded word, and I'm hesitant to use it because What it is, it's an identity of thought, right? You know, you take the people who are staffing bays and who are staffing, you know, quite a lot of the upper echelons of the political parties, and for them, fossil fuels are just kind of, you know, they're part of the economy, and you can't be nasty to those people who are such a central part of the economy. They don't need to be bribed to think that. I mean, I don't think, for example, that Trudy Harrison, a Conservative MP in West Cumbria, was bribed to support a coal mine opening, which, you know, has just been agreed. It's profoundly wrong, but they are not.
We could talk about ethical corruption as well. But let's
okay,
move on.
yeah, all right.
Let's move on. So, Tamsin, you were itching to get in there as well.
Thank you. I just wanted to address the last sentence you threw in there. As a climate scientist, I think the BBC are the best in the world at reporting on climate science. And I say that as someone who's worked with them for many years, consulting, I've done news interviews. The last time the BBC asked me for an interview to cover climate change or air pollution was about the time I was leaving the house for this event. The time before that was, I think, Thursday. The time before that, I think, was Monday. The BBC Science Department, who make programmes about climate change, there are 3 BBC Science presenters in this room, work intensely hard to make sure that the evidence is accurately presented. Now, I admit that there was a 13-year gap between specialist BBC One programmes about climate change, between Attenborough's 2006 programme and the one this year. That's a slightly separate issue, and I still think the BBC were doing better than anyone else. But I think we have to absolutely nip in the bud any idea that the BBC are not trying to cover this. I was invited on a panel recently where they had all the staff come in and learn what net zero meant. They had Chris Stark from the Committee on Climate Change and me and various other climate scientists talking about it. They are working very hard to get this right. I listen to climate stories on the Today programme every other day now. You know, part of the reason I don't sleep at night is because I can't escape my job because it's on Radio 4 every other programme. So I think we have to be really careful about being paranoid about the media in that sense.
Okay. I was going to go to that gentleman there. I see you over there, but let's go to this one first. The gentleman in the back.
Yeah, very simple one. What's your take on overpopulation?
What's the take on human population?
Overpopulation.
Overpopulation. I'll tell you what, I'm going to actually say we're not going to answer that question because we could just go way off topic here. And I could also say as a BBC Science presenter, I've just made a programme about it and it'll be coming out later in the year. But let's try and stick... I know that obviously it's interrelated, but let's just try and stick solely to the climate here. Otherwise we could go off at a way tangent. OK.
Does fast fashion affect climate change and how so? And if you're on a low income, how can you make changes to stop climate change when you can't afford more sustainable fashion?
OK, go on.
I'd like to just answer the first part. I'm sure people here are far more qualified actually to answer it than me, but only because I've literally just been researching it for my own understanding of it. Basically, fast fashion and anything that we consume or use that isn't made in a sort of carbon neutral way, in the sense that isn't made sustainably, is a way of actually outsourcing our carbon emissions to something that's called embedded emissions. So embedded emissions is this phrase that's bandied around, which is about the fact that stuff that we eat, drink, wear, wash our clothes in, use as a toaster, whatever, has at some point used carbon dioxide emitting fossil fuels in the manufacture of those products. And what's even worse is that a lot of those products, if they are then imported into the UK, there is a huge amount of fossil fuel use and therefore carbon dioxide emissions from the import methods, which are more often than not flights. So it sort of brings me back to the last question, which I kind of wanted to address, but it actually is part of the same thing, is that a recent report came out to show that of all the G7 countries, so of all the sort of really the big emitters, the UK has the highest amount of imported carbon dioxide emissions. In other words, embedded within the food, drink products that we use. So fast fashion is a particular culprit of clothes that are made far away in ways that are releasing huge amounts of carbon dioxide emissions that have to then be flown into this country, and more to the point, they're sold cheaply because they're not made particularly high quality. Therefore, you have to get rid of them, buy new ones, or they're made in a way that is designed for us to want to need to get rid of them because they're not high quality, and designed in a way where they meet a certain fashion market, and then within a few months they're out of fashion and we have to buy more. So there are many reasons why fast fashion is particularly damaging, and it feeds into this narrative, which I hear a lot as someone who is constantly up against climate deniers or up on media interviews. The question I often get asked is, oh, but the UK only produces 1.5% of the carbon emissions globally. Now, this is true, as far as I'm aware. But firstly, this is twice as much as we should be producing per head anyway, if we looked at our UK population. So it's still twice the size it should be. Secondly, historically we've emitted far more than our fair share because we started the Industrial Revolution. That's where all the carbon dioxide initially came from. But more importantly, there's three other issues. One is that this imported carbon dioxide emissions are higher than for any other G7 country, and a lot of that is to do with the food we import. We import 50% of our food, 70 to 80% of our fruit and vegetables, and a lot of our fast fashion, which is not made to last. Secondly, fossil fuel subsidies, which we've already mentioned. Over the past 5 years, the UK has invested £2.5 billion in subsidising fossil fuels in low to middle income countries. Now, that doesn't get counted in our 1.5%, which are our terrestrial emissions, nor does shipping, and nor does aviation. So this 1.5% itself is complete nonsense. And finally, we as a country, we are responsible for 30% of the global carbon dioxide emissions through investments in from banks that have their national or international global headquarters in the City of London. And that is an enormous amount. So that also brings us to the points of what we could be doing personally, is looking at your fast fashion consumption, your consumption of food and drink that's imported. And yes, dairy and meat is particularly problematic for separate reasons as well as the imports, but also to be looking at where you're investing your money and checking and finding out what is happening to that money, the money that you have earned, that you are investing in your future, that you're putting aside for your kids' university funds, whatever it is, could be actually being used to invest in fossil fuels, which are compounding and damaging your children's futures.
Thanks, Emily. Now, I just want to remind you, in case you've slipped your mind, the demand. Keep your demand in mind. We'll come to that shortly. Darren, did you want to ask something just briefly to that?
I suppose one caveat is this is my answer as a father of 3 teenage daughters rather than a chief executive of a nature conservation organisation. And I would really recognise the challenge. And what I'm not going to do is offer you an answer, because I don't think you need an answer from, frankly, a middle-aged man who's got far too much clothes in his wardrobe than he actually needs. And I think one of the things that we have to do, and I've got this challenge with my daughters, is persuade them that they don't need every new fashion that comes out. And I don't know how to do that. I'd be interested in your view, because you look like you have that challenge much more than I do myself. But and you don't have to give me an answer now, because but I would be really interested to find out, because I think, like many of the questions that we get asked today and in our everyday lives, the answers don't sit necessarily in the heads of people who look like me, who've had my life. The answers are out there in a much broader context and a much wider community. And I think my overall answer for a lot of this is we need to open up a conversation that gets to far more people, because the answers are in their heads and not necessarily in mine. And if my panellists will forgive me, aren't theirs either.
Well, hold on. There's a young lady here. Let's...
Except one.
So I'm a teenager. I go to a high school, and I'm in quite a pressurized environment where I'm expected to wear certain things and like certain things and do certain things. And I think it all comes down to attitudes, because it's all very well to say that we need to buy more secondhand clothes. But, yeah, as I said, I'm young people who buy a lot of fast fashion. and expected to buy new things every month because what they were wearing previously is gone out of fashion. It's very difficult to step out of line and not fall into that fast fashion cycle. So personally, I try to only buy second-hand clothes now, but that is still quite difficult when, yes, as I said again, that we're expected to wear certain things and wear things that are in fashion at that time. So I think we need to change attitudes, because that's where the problem is right now.
Okay, stick with you, Holly. I was going to ask a question that one of the readers has sent in. It's a difficult one, which I'm sticking with you. Do you think that our reaction to high-profile figures who are flying around the world, so maybe members of the royal family, maybe some Hollywood film stars, who are at the same time beginning to champion the need to think about the environment, is fair, deserved, or productive?
I think that lots of people look up to Hollywood film stars and football members, and they're the royal family, as role models, and they think that when I grow up I want to be like them and I want to have a private jet. And so it's really important that these people speak out about the environment, because they have large followings and lots of supporters and people who admire them and hold on to their every word. And so when these people start to speak out about the environment, then I think people who follow them and support them start to listen to them. And obviously this follows on to personal choice, because if one of the royal family members said that I'm not going to fly in a private jet because this is bad for the environment, it makes people think about that and say that this is actually serious, where they're prepared to not do that because this is really important.
Maybe they don't make that decision overnight, because we all change our minds at different speeds, don't we? I was vegetarian for years, and then last Christmas I suddenly thought, no, do you know what? I'm going to go vegan. It took me quite a long time to get to that point. So we do all change our mind at different paces. Should we cut them some slack? It's on their mind, they're talking about the environment. Is it worth criticising them at this point when they're talking about it? And at some stage in the future, maybe they'll think, do you know what? I'll give up the old private jet.
I think we need to encourage people with high profiles to start to speak out about the environment, but we also need to, I think, put pressure on them and say that, well, you say you care about the environment, but you're about to jet off to South Africa for a week or so. And I think it's quite a fine balance between being supportive of them speaking out and saying that this is important and we're in a crisis situation, but then not acting like it. So, yeah, there is quite a fine line between those two things.
Okay, jolly good. There was a question at the back there. Man's been itching.
Hi. My question is with regards to everyone's purporting, well, not everyone, but there's a lot of solutions being had from renewables like solar panels and wind turbines. My question is the fact that the region I come from in India is not just one of the biggest mining states in India for coal, but it's also the biggest mining state in India for lithium, cobalt, bauxite, all these minerals for our green technology. And it's the same in Congolese in Africa as well, which is the biggest mining state, mining country. How is any of this green when there's slave labor, there's sex slave scandals where girls and women are put into sex slave camps, and then they go through all these other camps as well, whatever they are, and then we're sold this product, which is supposedly green, and then as I've learned from people in the industry, what do you think happens to those products at the end of life? They're actually ending up in solar panel waste mountains in Africa. Now, this is not something factored into the whole supply chain. That everyone's talking about reparations. Yeah, reparations for 400 years of slavery, but what about the reparations for what's already going on right now? And there's no cognition of that. And also the other thing I'd like to quickly ask is that a lot of this raw materials is required for this new technology, like 5G smart technology, which we don't need, but it's been proven to be inherently dangerous. But my key question is how is any of this sustainable when it's got, sorry to be frank, but it's got brown and black blood all over it, and there's no cognition of it at all. So,
okay, so there's a couple of points there. Let's address with the first one, which is the movement, the new technologies that we're evolving maybe not perfect. Mike, we have to develop new things. We go through a process in science of coming up with ideas, testing them, honing them, perfecting them, and then something better comes along. That's part of a process, isn't it?
It is. But I think the point also makes clear that what we can't do is we develop new technologies, that we can't turn a blind eye to how they may be manufactured or how the materials might be extracted as well. Friends of the Earth is an international network, and we hear those stories absolutely from our sister groups across the world. None of those groups say we don't need renewables, because everybody agrees that we need to have renewable energy. We need to move from fossil fuels to renewables, but we need to develop that industry in a clean, green way with decent jobs. And the inequality that is a prime... I said earlier on that you can only look after the planet if you look after people. And that's absolutely true here. You can't have exploitative industries to produce something that is then given a green badge without any questions around it. We need to make those products in a clean, green way, and we need to reduce the inequality across the world that leads to those types of circumstances happening. The truth is, whatever we make will have an impact somewhere, so that's also another reason for saying we need to be much more efficient in what we do, less of a throwaway society, much more energy efficient, because while we need a lot more renewable power, we can reduce the amount we need by making sure we use energy much more efficiently as well. But yeah, we can't close our eyes to some of these impacts around the world, nor should we, but we can't also at the same time deny the need for much more renewable energy.
If we maximise our energy efficiency in the UK, we could meet 11% of our 2050 carbon neutral targets, 11%. And when you think that we've done quite a few of the easy things, we've also been disingenuous about the figures, as Emily's pointed out. Us sorting out energy efficiency is something that we should be driving to do straight away. Surely it's one of the last easy fixes, Doug.
Yes, it is. And what we haven't done is institute the incentives and the regulation to make it happen. So, there was a report from the Labour Party over the weekend saying they wanted to do, I think they came up with a figure of 250 billion to insulate homes across the UK. That seems about the right sort of scale. And the rules that are put in place around treasury lending, for example, make that quite difficult if you stick to the rules. But if ever there was a moment to break the rules, I think we're coming across it now. It's like, yes, of course, civilization collapsed, but we kept the public sector borrowing requirement under control. So there are a lot of things that can be done. I mean, one of the most effective climate policies there has been, period, in the UK, has been the EU. I mean, the EU red tape, actually. EU standards on performance of products and appliances, demanding progressive increases in efficiency across refrigerators, across air conditioners, across even mobile phones. And that has driven energy efficiency into the marketplace, not just in the UK, but right across the EU. I do just want to pick up on the question, though, because I think it's a really important one. Because saying, we're extracting all these, or the green economy of the future needs to extract all these metals in order to deliver on the promise. Is it green at the moment? No, it absolutely is not. And, we're actually very aware of it. So we're hoping to publish something with Amnesty, probably next year now, about the terms and conditions of lithium, cobalt, nickel, and other metals extraction. Because at the moment, just like with the waste solar panels, we're expecting the same system that delivered fossil fuel subsidies, but also abandoned oil rigs in the North Sea, leaking oil oil wells that were abandoned, not to say oil spills. We're expecting the same system that produced all that to produce clean, renewable energy at both ends. And it won't unless there is a much better level of oversight from those people who are looking after the public interest in doing so. Now, that presents profound problems and difficulties when you're talking about somewhere like the Congo, where government isn't what it could be, let's put it mildly. But it doesn't mean that the transition shouldn't take place. It means that we have to be much better at it than we've been with some of the stuff we've dealt with before.
Okay. Emily, briefly then, and we've got time for one more question.
Yeah, I just want to make a brief point about that as well, because we're talking about the fact that it may not be as green as it could be, and it also might, well, it is sort of morally reprehensible in the way that you've indicated. But also, sorry to be bearer of bad news, but we should also be aware that, for example, electric cars, which a lot of this mining is for lithium, for the batteries, for electric cars, that's the big new craze of, if we get electric cars, then it's all going to be okay. But actually, if you actually look at the carbon emissions, and if you look at what I mentioned before about embedded carbon emissions, so the carbon dioxide that is released as in the process of making those cars in the first place, if you average this out over the lifetime of a typical electric car and compare it to a current normal petrol car, actually we're still looking at kind of around 50% of the carbon emissions of a normal car. So that's only a 50% reduction. Okay, it's half, but that's nonsense if we're putting all of our energy in this and we're emotional energy in it and saying, okay, it's going to be the future, then actually it kind of evens itself out after, if we've got twice as many cars, then it's just the same problem as we've got at the moment. So we just need to be very careful about looking at this as a sort of silver bullet. Plus, people have been mentioning air pollution, which is another huge impact of fossil fuel production. As has been mentioned before, 80 people every day in the UK die from air pollution. We are at levels of air pollution in the UK that are actually illegal, and we've been taken to court in, I believe, in Europe for this, as the UK. And actually, studies have shown that electric cars are not actually going to reduce pollutants, what so-called particulates, which are the stuff that goes in the air that causes air pollution toxicity, by very much at all, possibly only by about 30%, because a lot of the air pollution from cars is actually wear and tear on tyres and use of brakes and wear and tear of road surfaces. So electric cars are not a magic bullet, and I think, as we've talked about before with kind of saying, oh, well, if I recycle or I don't eat meat, I can kind of not worry about it. It's the same about electric cars. If we kind of say, oh, well, we're doing this and we've got green technologies, we've got a huge moral issue with the people in the mines who are mining for lithium, but also we're not actually addressing the problem nearly, in fact, even fractionally as much as we should be.
Okay, time for one last question. There's a gentleman there with a hat.
Hi, you're right. Sitting in a room and listening to all of you speak about the level of crisis that we are in, it's difficult to see how this level of concern isn't, consensus. But the reality is that it's not. Even as a young person, I speak to people every day, and I'm surrounded by people who don't really care about the climate issue or see about the protests and the stuff on the tube, and actively have disdain for environmental groups like Extinction Rebellion or Greenpeace. And my question was, should we be considering a strategic change in the messaging of these groups to try and reach out a hand to those that don't agree with us, to try and make it as less of a partisan issue as we can?
Okay, Natalie, let's come to you. We face this problem, yes, indeed. In terms of asking people to protect wildlife, don't we? I played devil's advocate earlier and said that many people don't need a puffin; they like a puffin. I'm not so fond of a puffin myself. I think they're a bit gaudy, but let's move over that. We've got to convince a wider proportion of people to not only care, but to act. And that's a tough call, isn't it?
Yeah, but I think the first thing is that I agree that throwing more fact at people is unlikely to achieve much more. I do think that there's something about empowerment. So you were, for example, saying, well, electric car is not helping. So if you keep on removing option for people to start to engage, then slowly you're going to have no engagement. It's a little bit the same with wildlife. What we see is that if you start to create a connection, any connection, then you can start to open the dialogue. So it can be as silly as bringing wildflowers in a garden, because then you start to bring back the discussion. You start to see it, you start to act with it, you start to interact with it. I'm not saying this is the only solution by a mile, by the way. But I do think that a lot is about personal stories, personal engagement, empowerment, feeling that you can help, you can contribute. It's not someone else, somewhere else, deciding about something. You can, even if it's a small role, even if it's something, it allows you to interact with the topic, to get interested into it, to learn more, to want to learn more. And in a way, as we've been discussing before, a transition and change take time, and it's a path. It's not a yes or die. It's not a do it or you'll be punished forever, and so will your children, grandchildren, and everything. So if you want to move people, you're going to have to accept that they all go at different pace. They do all relate to different things, and we're going to need to attack it from different angles. Some people react very well to fact. Some people love the personal story. Some people need to get active into it, to get something that grabs their attention. And I don't think we've been very good at that. And probably because, and I would very much agree with you before, we don't systematically have the diversity of people to bring the diversity of message and way to engage. We were very bad at bringing people on board. We always see the same type of people, me included, and we don't really have different voice, different perception, different way of thinking about it, and not systematically dismiss something, even if it looks insignificant. It's okay to be insignificant sometimes, because it's a first step towards something bigger. And that's whether it's wildlife or climate, I think it's the same. It's reaching out by diversifying ourselves and listening to people's concern, talking. We need more talking.
Well, I think that's certainly been part of our mission today. We're working with the UK tabloid newspaper, which has a very broad readership, many of whom wouldn't normally engage with the likes of yourselves. So this is, again, it's a step in the right direction. Okay, so we've run out of time for the questions, but we haven't run out of time for your demands. So, Darren, we'll start at that end. If you had one demand, what would it be?
One demand. Okay, so if it was one demand, I would say the biggest change we could do tomorrow is put a realistic price on carbon, because then what it would do would make for better choices. So better choices for how we manage our land, how businesses are managed, how people live their lives. And I think what we would also do is we would shift directly towards that 11% energy efficiency much more quickly, and we'd move towards the 34% food waste removal much more quickly. So we would end up in a scenario where we reward people for doing things that lock up carbon, and we give a realistic price for those businesses or industries that are actively emitting carbon.
Okay, well that was 3 demands, but we'll let you off because they were all pretty good ones. Mike?
So mine would be that the next Chancellor Exchequer, who I guess we'll know in just over a month's time, has 12 months to spend money on the right things rather than the wrong things, otherwise they lose their job.
Good. Holly?
I was going to do something different until I remembered that there's a general election coming up. So I think my demand is for people in general to vote for our futures and to vote for a planet. And please don't make this a Brexit election, because climate and ecological breakdown is the biggest issue we're facing today. And this needs to be an election about making the difference for the environment.
Okay, well, you've got the first round of applause today, but I think you should have the second, to be quite honest with you. Natalie?
My demand would be that everyone sets themselves an individual carbon budget. So decide how much you're okay to emit every year, and then do your research to start to think as to how you would use that. And I think that would help a lot, making people realize what is direct, indirect, what can I afford, what can I do, and start to think about those trading.
Okay, Doug?
Well, I gave you a foretaste, which is that we need to stop oil exploration, oil and gas exploration and production straight away. It's not just because we've already got more than enough than we can burn in terms of fossil fuels globally. But as soon as a company, and it usually is a company in the UK after all, has got some patch of ground where it knows there's hydrocarbons they can dig out, then they get a commercial interest in doing so. And I might have balked at the word corruption, but there is a distortion of the political system that comes as a direct consequence of that, as they will try very, very hard to make that happen. We see the end result of that in the pork barrel politics you get in the US, which we haven't got to the same extent in the UK, but it is still there. So as soon as fossil fuel is identified in the ground, somebody wants to extract it.
So my one demand would be that the government and the media listen to the scientists and tell the absolute truth about the climate and ecological emergency, just how bad it is and just how fast we need to act to prevent catastrophe.
I would ask that you don't despair. Climate change is not something that is won or lost. It's not a binary. It's not something where we do absolutely everything and everything's fine, or we do nothing and everything is awful and the whole of society collapses and billions die. It will be somewhere between the two. And we have to both accept the changes that will happen in the climate and the changes that are happening in our society, and know that it's a spectrum and it's a gradient and it's a block of stone that sits in front of us that we chip away at. And we have the tools to chip away at it. And we keep chipping. And every year and every 6 months and every 3 months, the predictions at the climateactiontracker.org website go down for what we think global mean temperature will be in the future. And that's because we are putting in place more and more policies. We are chipping away. So it's not won or lost. It's something that is worked on probably for the rest of our lives.
Thank you very much. Well, that brings our panel discussion to a close. I think we've had the truth. We've had some profound truths, actually. We've had some good ideas, and we've had some poignant moments. So I think they all deserve a round of applause. So we're going to wrap up by handing over to the Mirror's environmental editor, Nada Farhood, who's going to wrap things up this afternoon.
Just want to say, firstly, a big thank you to our panel for joining us today. I know you've got very busy schedules, and to Chris for taking time out to chair it today. There have been many, many great points that have been raised today, and what we're going to do is take them all away, summarise them for next week for our Green edition, and then we are going to come up with a list of 5 demands that we're going to put pressure on the December 12th election and the new government that forms further beyond for proper environmental change. Some of the points that were raised that we've heard today are, from stopping the expansion at Heathrow Airport, a People's Assembly that maybe some of our readers could participate in, that all our lifestyles must change in a line for what we're calling for politically, and they start at very small changes to big changes from giving up flying. But whatever, it's crystal clear from all our panellists here today that the climate change is not a future threat. It's happening now, and it's a real threat. And I just wanted to leave you with one final thought. Over the summer, I travelled to Greenland for a special climate change edition for the Daily Mirror. And this was to explain to our readers why climate change is a matter for them to take to heart. Here I found a community battling with its new reality. As countries are struggling to limit their 1.5 degree warming I found, as countries struggle to limit overall warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, Arctic residents here are already experiencing temperature rises way higher than this in less than one generation. After Europe baked in record temperature heat waves in August, this most northerly town in Greenland is experiencing 22 degrees, resulting in record ice melt. I found kids swimming in the sea, locals wearing T-shirts that 10 years ago it was unheard of in August. Punters are now working in supermarkets. Families are struggling to afford to eat. Houses are being pulled down. And so this is the effects of the climate change that is happening now. I'm telling you this story because on this trip that I realised the effects of global warming are simply not equal. What is happening here, what we're pushing out with fossil fuels, is having a devastating impact thousands of miles away on a community that can't control. And so why it's important for us to, at the Mirror, to keep explaining to our readers, and with all your help and your help here today, that the climate change is everybody's issue, and this is why we need to be engaged to make these changes. So big thank you for the audience for participating today as well. Big thanks to you guys. Thank you.